Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my first update on my experience with the Sony A7R Mark III. Now, this is a camera 3 years in the making, $3,200 US, and in my opinion, superior in just about every way to the A7R Mark II. But I'm not getting into that. That will be saved for a comparison. Again, this video is all about the update on the experience with the Mark III. So I've had only a day to run this thing through its paces. And so far, from what I can tell, just about everything that Sony set out to complement, fix, enhance, they did exactly that. So some key things you should know about this $3,200 camera is that it, of course, has a 42 megapixel sensor, which is basically the same rating that you have with the A7R Mark II. However, Sony has changed the processor inside of this, also the orientation of that processor in relation to the full frame sensor that is under the hood. And that makes a big difference in terms of performance. And that's part of the reason that what Sony really did was take their best full frame mirrorless camera ever and just make it better. And in my opinion, you're really going to be searching and trying incredibly hard to find areas where the A7R Mark III truly will disappoint you. And that's because with the new battery that was launched alongside the A9, a far more expensive camera coming in at around $4,500 US, but that does boast 20 frames per second, 24 megapixel full frame still capability. Here we've got the 40 plus megapixels and 10 frames per second, which is far from being shabby. In fact, you will not find this sort of performance anywhere else on the market. Forget at a price point like this. So $3,200 may sound like a lot, but if you're a professional or an aspiring pro, this is right now between the battery autofocus improvement and the dual SD card slot that you can see right here, which is not perfect. It isn't, the fact that only one slot supports UHS 1 and the other two, of course, means that you don't have the highest performance that you possibly could with both slots. But still, this is the sort of feature set you expect from a professional grade piece of gear. In addition to that, I already mentioned the battery life, which is somewhere beyond double what the traditional W series battery could yield with any other mirrorless camera made by Sony. So that's one area where the Z really is a game changer. So people who think that this is really a mild enhancement to what you have with the A7R Mark II, I would argue against that thoroughly, because this, as great as a camera can be, if you can't actually use it, it's not as good as it could be potentially. And carrying around 10 batteries is a solution, but not a good one. Here, you're not going to have to do that. As I mentioned, storage, no longer a real issue. If you have a 512 gig card, which if you can afford a camera like this, you likely can afford one of those, then having that, high-speed slot filled with 512 gigs of storage should be a pretty good starting point. And then if your backup is another 512 or 256 at a slower speed, I think that's a pretty good compromise. In terms of image and video quality, you have a star as you did in the A7R Mark II, but again, better autofocus, superior literally in terms of the number of phase and contrast detection points. You have a larger body that inherently makes handling full frame lenses, especially if you're going to the G Master lineup, much easier to compensate. Now, is it still going to compete with the form factor that you'll get from Nikon or Canon? No, these are not gigantic bodies. They are large for mirrorless bodies, but that's about it. They still are substantially smaller than any competing product, which right now is inferior. And I'll reiterate that through the course of this video and everything else regarding the A7R Mark III. And that's what it does share in common with the A7R Mark II, is that much like when that camera launched 3 years ago, roughly 3, nothing else could compete with it because nothing else had its feature set. And that's the same with regard to the Mark III we're looking at here. Best EVF on the market, highest resolution, best color reproduction, the widest angle view that you're going to get on an electronic viewfinder, the most, I would say, lifelike, real world, that gives you the flexibility to still, of course, adjust everything on the fly and see whether you're making a mistake or actually getting the shot you want. Weather sealing, I mention this all the time. Sony has it. I'm not going to test it. And I don't suggest that you do either. Not a recommendation here at all. Another important thing that Sony did here was add, beyond traditional micro USB, you now have USB Type-C, which means that you can charge this at a faster rate. You can also use a Type-C battery bank to power the camera while in use, which is of course good if working on the road and you're out of batteries. You've got a battery pack for your smartphone of choice that uses Type-C to charge. You can easily throw that on here. And that to me is a convenience, even though it still has micro USB. The multi-port that Sony leans on for a lot of things, I think, is very important and something that was sorely missing from the A9, a camera at a much higher price that of course appeals to a different niche, but should have had that connectivity. Now it does have a LAN port, an Ethernet port, that this camera does not, which is one of the differentiating factors besides the megapixel count and autofocus capability, prowess of the A9. But overall, the entire package, the fact that we have video profiles here, we have S-Log, we have dynamic range that you will not get with pretty much anything. I mean, if you're looking at the Nikon D850 or Canon's latest D5, you're not going to get the same performance. Now, this isn't a knock against what Canon or Nikon has to offer. They still make incredible digital imaging products. They just don't have the feature set that the Sony presents. And this is not just on paper, it's in real world use. And that's why these things that may seem small, like improving battery life, autofocus, dual SD card slot, Type-C charging, powering, transfer of files, especially if you're working with uncompressed raw files, that is something that you must really have on a camera in this class. But bear in mind that $3,200 US, as I always reiterate, since I know everyone watching is not necessarily in the US, it does command or an expectation of a certain feature set. And Sony didn't live up to that exact set with the A7R Mark II. And that's something they've really corrected here. And in practical performance, at least for the single day, battery life has been amazing. No overheating, which is something I probably should have mentioned at the top of this video rather than right now. Play memories, a thing of the past, but I haven't really gotten into that. Sony's been phasing that out. You know, the box has the Play Memories home marketing, but that's software for your desktop, not for your camera. So I really wish I had time-lapse, the app that's been around forever from Sony here on this camera, but I don't. Something I miss on my A7R Mark II. But that's really not a reason that I would ever consider not having this as my primary go-to camera. The screen has touchscreen capability. This is again something that was taboo for Sony for many, many years, but now is really a standard. Something, at least at this point, they've put into, I think, 4 or 5 different cameras on the high end. So that's a move that I think Sony will continue to do. They realize consumers expect that flexibility. And even just small things like making the gears here for the front dials more substantial. The fact that they're not only more difficult to actually turn, but also thicker, larger. These, again, may seem like small things, but they really aren't when you are spending $3,200 on a camera and then potentially investing a lot more, much more than the value of the body in the lenses that you're going to use. So right now, I can tell you without any hesitation that if you're looking to shoot stills, video, the 4K video capability of this camera is phenomenal so far, what I've seen. I was not surprised by that because the A7R Mark II was better than anything I'd ever seen in its class. So I only expected even better overall performance from the A7R Mark III. Remember, this camera is 3 years in the making. This is not something that we got a year after the A7R Mark II launched, and you can tell because Sony really just took an already amazing product and improved on all of its weak points, which you couldn't even argue at the time were weak points because nothing else competed with it or offered a similar capability in its class and specifically for its price. And that's something I always will reemphasize. You know, people look at Sony because they're the baby of the DI imaging industry, the DI, world. But the reality is that you have to remember Konica Minolta, Sony took that over. They already were the best in the business basically when it came to video capture, and they combined those two capabilities. And the A7R Mark III really does, at this point, put them right in line with the rest of the competition and at a more competitive price point. And now there is so much glass out there, E-mount, full-frame native glass, that I don't have to tell you that you can adapt Canon, Nikon, whatever your legacy lens of choice is, even though you can still do that, because there really is a large enough ecosystem of full-frame E-mount glass that you can easily purchase the lenses you want and get rid of your old gear, and it would make sense. On the other hand, if you're in love with a certain lens, go ahead and adapt it. Throw a mount on there, and there are many to choose from. So it's really a matter of choice, and the fact that you've got the 5-axis image stabilization will offset the fact that your lens likely does not. And that's been something that ever since Sony introduced the 5-axis image stabilization has been a game changer unto itself in terms of adaptation of glass. But that was when the full-frame E-mount glass market hadn't fully matured, and it's still maturing. I mean, this camera launched alongside two affordable, very competent, a wide angle and a telephoto lens that both interested me, but I have enough E-mount glass that I'm not there to purchase that. Many of you, on the other hand, the two lenses that this launched alongside, the 12 to 24, and I think the other lens is the 24 to 104, I may be off slightly on that, are both affordable, very strong performers, kind of replacing where Zeiss used to be in Sony's lineup. So you've got a lot of options, and of course, if you want to blow the whole load, you go up to the G Master level of glass, which has taken over what used to be Zeiss's positioning in Sony's E-mount lineup. So Sony has really taken control of their entire brand, gotten things in order, I think made things less confusing, even though I used to get upset about their renaming of the, taking the E-mount NEX line, converting it over to A-mount, which of course was always the mechanical only, the real digital SLRs. But now we have mirrorless living in the same ecosystem in terms of name. And now that all of their investment really has shifted to full frame mirrorless, like what we're looking at here, you don't have an experiment anymore. You're not part of a transition. You're not part of Sony testing the waters. The A9 was beyond proof of concept that they could deliver the fastest and most accurate sports photography camera on the market. They gimped, I don't like using that word, they limited some of the video features because it was directed specifically at a niche audience that wanted speed. Here we have really the best of both worlds because not everyone requires 20 frames per second. The A7R Mark III at 10 really does a phenomenal job. And then if you decide to use mechanical or electronic shutter, of course those numbers drop off slightly. You do have you don't have the blackoutless experience on the electronic viewfinder that you do with the A9, but you certainly have a far superior, in fact, I would say night and day experience to that of which you would be facing with the A7R Mark II. And that says a lot, again, about how this camera has been refined, retooled, enhanced, and really changes what you can get both on a still and video side in the year, well, nearly 2018, but the end of 2017. And you are not going to see anything from Canon or Nikon anytime soon that will be as capable as this camera, and definitely nowhere in the same ballpark of at least the body price. That I will say. When it comes to glass, Sony's charging a premium, and they can, because they still are competitive there. And that is really the most compelling thing to me about what Sony's done here, is that they were always trying to lure customers over. Now it's kind of a no-brainer, especially if you were already a fan of Sony products, because you're not only getting the best performance, you're getting the best performance at essentially the lowest cost in the industry. So Sony has kind of produced here, in my opinion, with the A7R Mark III, a deal that's just an offer that's too good to refuse. Of course, there are other options. You can stick with Canon, you can stick with Nikon and pay more for less. You're fully invested in a lens system. I get it. But at some point, if the competition doesn't step up, and I said this very same thing about the A9, if no one else steps up to the plate, Sony continues to push the envelope, and now it's not pushing the envelope anymore. Now it's setting the standard, because they have brought all of the pro-grade features that professionals would have said, well, this is what's keeping me from getting on board with Sony. They've now wiped that slate clean. And that's what I've seen so far with the A7R Mark III. Overall, great performance. I can't complain about anything because I have never shot with a camera of this capability other than the A9, which of course lacked much of the capability that the A7R Mark III has in terms of resolution, dynamic range, and more importantly, the video prowess. So you really have a camera that can do it all at a price that in today's scope is quite affordable. Even though $3,200 may sound like a lot. But that pretty much is my current update on my experience. Again, only one day in. I'm sure that I'm going to find out, negative elements, other things, drawbacks, but so far the key things are better battery life, as I said at the top of the video, superior autofocus to anything that I've shot full frame with other than the A9, which says a lot because the A9 is all about that. And last but not least, the dual SD card slot, improved EVF, these are all things that make the A7R Mark III the type of camera that you can depend on, especially since I've seen no signs of overheating, which is likely a result of Sony implementing the firmware update that they pushed to the A9, which is really a control of the threshold of the heat inside the camera that the sensor can withstand without things getting so toasty that it melts. With that, instead of it being a knee-jerk reaction to complaints on forums about it overheating. Hopefully that doesn't shorten the life of the camera. I doubt that it will, because one thing I haven't ever had an issue with, really with any of these cameras, I can't name a single Sony camera I've reviewed that died on me, which is very impressive. At any rate, that rounds things out. Hope you all enjoyed. This video ran longer than anticipated. Surprise, surprise. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.